watching here with us, also on Zoom. Please feel free to use your chat window to join us on live. And we have started our recording as well. So I would like to welcome everybody. My name is Kim Goff. I am a learning program developer at the Royal BC Museum. I hope you're doing well and finding ways to take care of yourselves however you need to. I'm coming to you from my home on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people here in Esquimalt. In this series, we're talking with staff of the museum who've been asked to work from home about their work, research, and maybe even things that happened before their work, which is in the case of today's presenter. Today, we have curator of botany, Dr. Ken Marr. As the curator of botany, Ken is responsible for documenting and collecting plants in British Columbia. But before that, he was the curator. But before he was the curator at the Royal BC Museum, Ken spent some time in China, which is the catalyst for today's conversation. And nice because it is Asian Heritage Month. So Ken, when did you first go to China?
First time I went to China is actually spring of 1980. And I went again in 1995, and then we lived in China from 97 to 99.
Okay, and the work so you lived there from 97 to, so for 2 years, almost 3 years?
2.5, yeah.
Yeah, and during that time, were you studying botany, or were you doing other things as well?
I was there, the main reason to be there was to study botany.
Mm-hmm. And that leads us to our presentation today. Your main interest was, what were you hoping to find out? What were you looking at when you were there?
Yeah, I'll get into that in the presentation, but I was documenting, learning about the use of some melons that occur in China and all of Southeast Asia into India.
Excellent. All right, well, if you want to share your screen, we can see some of your images and learn more about that.
So, there. Okay, can you see me all right? See
the
presentation?
Do.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, this is work I did while I was associated with the Museum of Anthropology at the University of Michigan, living in China for 2.5 years, from 97 to 99. It was a fantastic experience, and it was everything I'd hoped it would be. So what the general topic today is ethnobotany, which is all about plants and people. And plants have all kinds of meaning in our lives, symbolic meaning, but they also have a lot of use, medicine, and all the tools that we use that come from plants, such as the wood to build our homes. But my interest in ethnobotany really focuses on food plants, cultivated plants, and the process of domestication from the wild. So everything you've eaten today didn't exist as it was the wild ancestor existed 8,000 years ago, but the domesticated form did not exist. And a field like this where you have all the plants, even height, even stage of ripening is totally an artifact of the process of domestication and human management of the landscape. And domestication, as is illustrated from the peppers below, has resulted in tremendous diversity within all of our cultivated plants, all of our crop plants. So Kim asked, what did I hope to learn? This is what I hope to learn. These are some melons, melon in the broad sense. So don't think of watermelon, don't think of cantaloupe, think of melons in the melon family, broad sense. So the place of domestication for these plants is unknown. This is the case for a few of our food plants, so mostly it is known where most of our food plants came from. I was also interested in the cultural importance of these foods, of these crops, and how have humans changed these plants from their wild state. So we start off living in Kunming, which is in the province of Yunnan, bordering Laos and Myanmar, and Vietnam in the east. And it's a large mountainous province, as you'll see later. Well, you'll see it right now. So it's tremendously diverse habitat and cultural diversity. So the elevations range from 70 meters, where the Red River crosses into Vietnam, to about 5,000 meters on the eastern end of the Tibetan Plateau. So as you can imagine, an area with such habitat diversity has a tremendous number of species. And as well, there's 22 cultural minorities, the non-Han Chinese people of China. So up in the far west of the province is the Tibetan Plateau. Here's a field of barley growing in front of the monastery. Down into the tropics, just across the river from where we lived, is a village of the Dai minority, who are the majority people in the basins of southern Yunnan province. And along the border with Myanmar, Jingpo people. And many of these people live across international boundaries. Here's the Bulong people, pairs of husband and wife planting a field to upland rice at the beginning of the wet season. And so we spent our first few months in Kunming. My wife and I both had private tutors for Mandarin. My tutor is the woman to the right, a delightful woman who spoke no English. Fortunately, I had studied Mandarin before, so we got to be good friends, and that's her husband there with her. And then after about 6 months in Kunming, we moved down into the tropics, about a 4-hour drive from the border with Laos, in a pretty remote part of China called the Xishuangbanna. And here we're living at the Research Institute of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And this institute was established in the early 1960s. So it's both a research institute and a botanical garden. And as the Chinese economy has started to grow and allow a fair bit of internal Chinese tourism, this is a desirable destination. So they doing, in addition to the ornamental gardens, they're doing an awful lot of really important research on the tropics, both wild situations, such as this meteorology tower, where they're documenting all kinds of meteorological measurements throughout the forest canopy. I climbed up to the top of that tower. It was 50 meters tall, and that's a long way off the ground. They're also working on agroforestry, which is kind of integrated different crops. And then they have a seed bank that was donated by the French government, where they're preserving the seeds of lots of different rice cultivars. This is where we lived, back in the corner here, in the Shangtai-Jian, which is the ecology station. Fabulous neighbors who spoke no English, and so that was real impetus for us to improve our Chinese. Our daughter spent her first year in China and was just adored by everyone who encountered her. So began the field work. My goal was to collect samples from as many different parts of the province as I could. And I won't go into too much of the genetics involved. So I was collecting seed samples, and I also was collecting ethnographic information. So right here, the woman here with the arrow is my Chinese colleague named Xia Yongmei, Professor Xia Yongmei. She was a great help, just a tremendous person and very kind. And this kind of paralleled the project she was doing as well. So it worked out well for us to work together. Never got tired of going to villages. Here's just kids being kids, as they are all over the world. Skip rope here, they're using a rattan vine. And one evening close to the border with Laos, here's me playing basketball with some kids, and it was really fun. It didn't seem odd to them at all that this white guy would wander onto the basketball court and just kind of have fun with them. And being able to speak a little bit of Mandarin really facilitated all kinds of situations such as this one. So the Mandarin names for melon are really consistent, and if anyone studied Chinese, it's a very logical language. So you'll see that the word gua is part of the word for just about every Chinese melon of various kinds, whereas in English, they're very diverse. So what does cantaloupe have in common with watermelon or cucumber? But Chinese is much more logical in this way. The final one, the hulu, which I'll mention at the very end, is kind of interesting because it's not a type of gua in the Chinese language. So an interesting question is, why isn't it gua? It is a melon like any others. And then finally, this interesting situation here where you have di gua, which isn't a melon at all. It's a large root, which is jicama. And here's a photo I took in Chinatown here in Victoria. The Chinese Institute where we were working was doing development work in Laos to try to get Laotian farmers to grow crops other than opium poppy. And so I had an opportunity to do field work there as well. So the way I would do this, and obviously with a lot of support from my Chinese colleagues, I'd find someone local who was willing to help out. I needed to collect seeds, so I would buy the melon and ask them to remove a few seeds, and then I'd return the melon to them, and they could use it for pig food or soup, whatever their need was. Also did some field work in Nepal, so anyone who's done research would understand that you need an area to compare what you're doing with. You need an area outside of the area where you're doing your own work in order to have a good comparison. So I wanted samples for genetic analysis from outside of China. So I was accompanied by a Nepalese ethnobotanist, Dr. Nirmal Bhattarai, and beside him is his porter. Tremendously helpful guy. Some of our field work was in areas that are off limits to the public, down in the Parsa Wildlife Preserve, and it's protected by the Nepalese army. There's a village near the army base, which is a bit surreal to be at an army base in the midst of this forest. So having collected seeds from China, Laos, and Myanmar, I brought them all back to the Institute. And here's my melon field. I paid to rent this and hired a local worker to help prepare the soil and then care for it. So the first plant I'll talk a little bit about is bitter melon. It is bitter, and the domesticated form is as bitter as the wild, which is unusual. If you're familiar with the Asian sense of medicine, and there's substances are hot or cool, and bitter melon is a cooling food. It's also a source of anti-diabetic. It's a source of a compound for treating diabetes. It's not an insulin substitute. There's some other mechanism. And there's been some investigation in terms of it being a source of medication for AIDS. So in North America, we tend to see food and medicine as very distinct entities. Food should taste good, medicine should taste bad. In the Asian context, food and medicine are pretty much the same thing. And so whereas we would only eat something because it tastes good, people in Asia would eat it because it's medicinal. So back to my original question, one of the original questions, how would we discern where this plant was domesticated? There's wild populations, as you can see at the bottom, from Laos, China, and Nepal. Which one of those areas gave rise to the domesticate? Which area did early cultivators start to cultivate this plant, bring it into their gardens, and begin that long transformation from a wild plant into the domesticate we have now? So in tropical areas, plant remains don't preserve well. They don't preserve at all, actually. So there's no archaeological remains to link the place of domestication. So in order to do this, I needed samples of wild plants from as many different locations as possible. And then I did some comparisons with the domesticate from various places as well. So one of the challenges then is, how are you going to do this kind of work? And one approach is to look at the morphology of the wild populations and compare them to domesticate. So then the challenge is how to describe a leaf mathematically. And I won't go into too much detail here, but here's all the different ways you can measure a leaf. And you can imagine leaves with different shapes are going to have different measurements. Then you can take all of those measurements and some more, and you can kind of synthesize them into 2 dimensions. And here's the wild, the C's are China, the N's Nepal, the L is Laos. So you can see the wild populations all clustered together here. And the domesticate from China and Laos are close to the wild. The domesticate from Nepal are less similar to those from the wild. So this would be fairly strong evidence that the plant was originally cultivated not in the Indian subcontinent, but further east in southern China, Southeast Asia. While it doesn't matter that we preserve the wild ancestors of our crop plants, well, here's the illustration right here, is that the wild bitter melon is completely resistant to insect damage, whereas the domesticate is totally ravaged by insects, a particular beetle that specializes on them. So in the process of domestication, an unintentional consequence is that the domesticated bitter melon lost its defensive compounds. And everything I'm saying now pretty much relates to any crop in the world. The importance of cultivating, preserving old cultivars cannot be overstated, and the wild ancestors. So the second plant I'll speed through here is loofah, the vegetable sponge. Many people may be familiar with this. You can use it as a bath sponge. Yeah, there's all kinds of uses. But before it becomes fibrous, the young fruit are something like a zucchini, and both the flowers and the fruit are edible. So here is the wild ancestor of the loofah sponge. Very, very small, intensely bitter. In fact, these plants produce the bitterest compounds that plant in the plant kingdom, the class of compounds called cucurbitacins. And then the rest of these are old cultivars, and this one here is a new cultivar that are not bitter. And bitterness seems to be controlled by 2 or 3 genes. So a mutation that prevents the synthesis of the bitter compounds was early on identified by some early cultivator looking for something to eat, found a non-bitter mutant, and that was the first stage in domestication. So going back to my other question is, what is the effect of domestication on the biology of these plants? And so I was growing all these plants in that garden, so I began measuring when was the date at which the first flower appeared, or how many days after planting. So think of this as the scale here is how many days after planting when does the first flower appear. And you can see on the far right, the wild plants began flowering quite a bit later than the domesticated plants, the China and Nepal domesticate. So again, it makes sense, human selection for earlier flowering. The earlier flowers, the earlier fruits, and the earlier there's a harvest. So the final plant I'll talk about is wax gourd or winter melon, which you can get in Chinatown here in Victoria or in Fairway Market. There is a beverage made from it, which I haven't actually tested. I think it would be pretty bland. Here's some cut up sections in a market in Thailand. And both Indian and Chinese people, East Indian and Chinese, have a candy they make by saturating the flesh in sugar. So you can see the importance and the diversity of old cultivars. So here's a typical new cultivar, which my lovely wife Cheryl is showing. You can see how huge it is. It doesn't have a lot of flavor. It's pretty bland. And the rest of the screenshot there, you can see old cultivars from a single village in Laos. And here on the right, that's a 15-centimeter long ruler. So when I took samples of these back to the Institute in China, the Institute director there was astonished at the diversity in Laos. In fact, he even questioned whether or not these were really wax gourd, but they are. So the area with the greatest genetic diversity is probably the area of original domestication. And so here's another approach at just looking at the range of seed sizes in China, Laos, and Nepal. And from this screen, one could also conclude that this particular plant, wax gourd, probably was not domesticated in Nepal, probably was domesticated in the area of China and Laos. So in one village we went to, the villagers stated that there was one type of wax gourd that couldn't climb a tree. They could only climb the ground, would be the translation. And so I grew up seeds of the various kinds here, and these are 3 different collections. Each number is a different collection. And you can see 1785, in fact, doesn't have a tendril. And that's why it can't climb the tree. It can only climb the ground. So then I began wondering, well, what would be the human select? Why would humans select for such a feature? And the villagers explained that when they harvest their rice in an upland rice field like this, if the plants, and they're growing lots of other crops in those fields as well. In fact, up to 80 different crops in such fields have been documented in the Philippines. So if there's a tendril on the plants, on the melons growing in that field, they wrap around the rice stems and make them more difficult to harvest. So is this intentional human selection or just chance? It seems like there could be intentional human selection. So the final thing I'm going to talk about is my interest in the cultural significance of these plants. And I'm going to just read a story. I'm going to read it so I get it right, that I was told by villagers here close to the border with Laos. How are we doing, Kim? Okay, so long time ago, human beings broke heaven's laws. A higher deity, Tian Shan, punished the people. The deity sent a lower deity, Lei Gong, to investigate. One family knew of the plan to send Lei Gong, so they killed a dog and sprinkled its blood on the roof of the house. On the way from heaven to earth, Lei Gong fell down on the roof of his family's home because the presence of the blood caused him to lose his power. The father of the family there, who actually represents all people, treated Lei Gong badly. He wanted to eat Lei Gong's flesh. The parents discussed how to eat him. Finally, they decided to pickle him with salt. They went to a far place to buy salt and asked their son to take care of Lei Gong. Lei Gong asked the little boy for some water. The little boy refused to give him any food or water because that is what his parents had instructed him to do. Lei Gong was very thirsty and asked the boy if he could have just a small amount of water, even if it was dirty. The boy relented and gave him a small amount. Lei Gong asked again and again that the boy give him some water. Lei Gong asked a third time and again was given water. Lei Gong returned to heaven and told Tian Shan, the highest deity, of his experience. Tian Shan was very angry at the way humans had treated Lei Gong, so he decided to flood the world. The Yao people believe that the ocean has a hole in the bottom, which allows the water to drain out of it, so that the land isn't drowned by water. Tian Shan, the higher deity, asked a lower deity, a jin, which is a devil, and in this case it's a crab, to put himself in this hole in the bottom of the ocean to cause the water level to rise. Lei Gong warned the small boy and his sister about the coming flood and sent the small boy some hulu, which is the Mandarin word for the bottle gourd, which is, here's a bottle gourd right here. So Lei Gong sent some seeds to plant. He told them to get into the fruit when the flood came in order to escape. The whole world was flooded. After some time, the hulu arrived with the boy and the girl at the gates of heaven because the water level was so high. Lei Gong thought that everyone had died. He asked the crab to go away so the sea level dropped. The brother and sister left the hulu and looked for other people, but they couldn't find any. The boy asked a turtle to look, but the turtle also reported that everyone had died. The turtle told the boy that he should marry his sister because there was no one else to marry. This made the boy angry, so he struck the turtle, and this is how the turtle got its pattern. The bamboo and the ant also told the boy to marry his sister. And the boy also beat them. So this is how bamboo got its pattern, segments, and how the ant became segmented. Lei Gong told the boy to plant a bamboo cutting on the top of one hill and his sister to plant one on top of another adjacent hill, and that when the two grew together, if they grew together, they should marry. 1 year later, the two bamboo shoots grew together and they got married. The girl gave birth to a wax gourd, which is why I started this story, not a child. The sister told the brother to separate the seeds and the flesh and to cut up the flesh. He was supposed to spread the flesh of the wax gourd in the mountains and the seeds in the valleys. But when he was about to do this, he tripped and forgot which was supposed to go where. And he spread the flesh in the basins and the seeds in the mountains. The Dai people who live in the basins and other lowland people came from the flesh and have a big population. The Yao people and other ethnic groups living in the mountains came from the seeds and have a hard life and a lower population because they had such a small start. So that's a story that actually has many versions in Southeast Asia. So I'm just going to finish by saying this is a bottle gourd with a corn cob stuffed in the end of it. And inside that bottle gourd are the seeds. This is how the villagers here stored the seeds. So the seeds of many of their important crop plants. So not only, the symbolism is that they came from a bottle gourd, and their future is tied up in the bottle gourd as well as they preserve this genetic diversity, which is so important to not only to their village, but to all of us who owe a debt of gratitude to early subsistence farmers who have preserved tremendous crop diversity for us.
Thank you, Ken. Wow. If you can stop sharing your screen. There we go. We got you back. I'm almost like overwhelmed with questions and thoughts about the presentation that you gave, and the importance of diversity and having those earlier examples was so beautifully illustrated when you were able to plant the two seeds side by side and could see that the one was more resistant to insect harvesting. And I was surprised and taken by your sort of experiential process that you had, being able to plant the seeds side by side and watch them and to see all of that. Is that something that was really a luxury of the amount of time you had, or is that something that's more common in botany and the study?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was a luxury to have that much time. That's called a common garden experiment, and it's done in many different ways. All over the world, people are interested in. It's trying to distinguish between environmental versus genetic differences, basically. So if you have if you bring a lot of plants from different environments together and the differences are maintained, then it's genetic. If they're not maintained, it's environmental. But yeah, you couldn't do that without more time, with the amount of time I had. Yeah, and actually I had enough time to grow crops 2 full cycles.
Oh, wow. I'm also wondering if, and I was thinking about archaeology and botanists, and you're looking at the diversity of seeds to kind of get a sense of origin, and I'm wondering if that's something you've ever worked on with other disciplines such as archaeology, to look at how seeds have and how plants have traveled around the world to base their origin.
I haven't myself, but for some of the crops that the seeds preserve better, that has been done. I do wood identification of archaeological remains, but not crop plants.
Right. Wow. Can you think of any current examples or stories where this process of where we're thinking, I guess, maybe more, where we're thinking more globally, or about this process of plant domestication? I guess what I'm trying to ask is,
Yeah.
is there any current issue where this is really an issue?
Yeah, this is going on all the time, because there's what's called a coevolutionary arms race between pathogens and crops. So plant breeders are constantly breeding new cultivars to try to stay ahead of the curve. As I mentioned that, though, the original gene pool they're working with is due to early cultivators, not the modern high-tech breeding. And there's new crops being bred right now. Saskatoon be one, and another plant called haskap, which comes from Siberia. They're cultivating now in the Bulkley Valley, and so yeah, Agriculture Canada is constantly looking for new potential crops to breed to improve. The wild ancestor is often pretty good, but there's improvements that can be made.
Mm-hmm. I feel like maybe last year I can remember reading a story about bananas, and an issue about bananas, because almost all of the bananas that we're eating in North America are coming from one.
Yeah.
And that's one seed, and that's becoming an issue, because it's getting maybe is it insects that are attaching it? Do you know?
No, it's a fungus called Panama wilt, and crops like bananas are especially vulnerable because they aren't cultivated. They're not propagated from seed. They're propagated from cuttings, and so they're genetically incredibly uniform. And so crops like that are really vulnerable because they don't have much inherent genetic diversity within them to be resistant to the fungus.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know people are thinking a lot about gardening today, these days, not only because it's spring, but because I think folks are maybe worrying about our own food security, and particularly for us on Vancouver Island, where we're on an island, and other places where folks are on an island. I think folks are thinking about the gardening and stuff. Do you have any tips or ideas for them about using heritage plants, or just going for it?
Yeah, convert your lawn to vegetables. And heritage crops are important. They may not have the high yield, but they have that genetic diversity that cannot be invented. So yeah, and in some cases they taste better. That, you know, there's a trade-off between taste and yield. And heritage crops may be more adapted for your particular situation than the highly bred strains. So try a mix of both, but convert your lawn to vegetables. And if you're not going to convert it to vegetables, convert it to wildflowers, native wildflowers, so that the other organisms that we share this planet with can enjoy it as well.
That's great. Thank you, Ken. And thanks everyone for joining us today for RBCM at Home. This program takes place every Tuesday and Thursday at noon. You can join us on Thursday when the curator of history, Dr. Lauren Hammond, will talk about the Royal BC Museum's newest publication, Spirits of the Coast, Orcas in Science, Art, and History. If you have young people in your lives, let them know about RBCM at Home on Wednesdays at 11 a.m. These sessions feature a museum educator and a staff member sharing activities you can do at home. Also on Wednesdays, we have RBCM at Home outside, and 2 p.m. tomorrow, Dr. Nancy Turner will be joining us. So if you're interested in ethnobotany, you'll definitely want to catch that. Links for all of these programs are posted on the Royal BC Museum's website. So again, thank you, everyone.